today we've got an interview with an author. He's a long-standing comrade and friend of mine that I've known for many, many years. And what I've learned about classical music, quite a lot I've learned from him, particularly because he's just written a new book, which is called Music and Capitalism. I'll just hold it up so you can see it. And we'll give you details of how you can get that, because you can get a special offer on it, which makes it a much more sort of decent price than sometimes these books are. So anyway, this is Sabby Sagall, who's written a whole number of books, but this latest one is his one on music and capitalism, which looks at a very, very wide range of composers and different sorts of music. So welcome, Sabby, and thanks for doing the interview. I'd like to ask you, first of all, why you wrote the book, and also why you cover a big range from Baroque music right through to modern music, 20th century music. And I'd just like to hear from you why it is you thought it was important to write about this.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Lindsay. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this video interview. Yes, I'm delighted to be here. Well, first of all, I've been a lifelong lover of music, all kinds of music, not just classical music, but, jazz and so on. And I studied piano from the age of 5 as well, and I still play a little bit. Also, over the last few decades, I've written articles on various composers, usually or to coincide with bicentenaries or centenaries of their birth or death, principally for Socialist Review, monthly magazine, which no longer exists. And then a friend of mine who had a contact with an editor at Palgrave Macmillan suggested I write a book about the subject of classical music and its relationship to Marxist theory. Of course, the other thing is that I'm a lifelong socialist, a Marxist, and it seemed to me that Marxism has a lot to say about art and culture. We know this from the writings of Marx and Engels themselves, and in particular, Trotsky is the 20th century a Marxist writer who devoted a lot of time to writing some very brilliant material articles, pamphlets on culture. So that's really, in a nutshell, the background.
Okay, and I think you make a very important point there, because if you look at the writings of the great Marxists, they do talk about cultural questions, perhaps much more than people might think. Because they do see it as something which helps us to understand the world. So we'll perhaps come on to that a bit later. But what I wanted to ask you first of all is why you kind of start where you start. You write about the development of tonality towards the end of the 17th century and how that influences particular different forms. And can you explain how that changed music and individual participation in it? Because that seems to me a major point of much of your writing in this book, is this, the individual becomes much more central to the role of music.
Yes. I mean, if you look at music in the medieval period, it's what's described as polyphony, a succession of tunes that simply echo each other without any kind of harmonic accompaniment, and music is very static. It's slow and static, and it fits well. It seems to express that particular style of polyphony, express a society that's dominated by apparently timeless, ordered, God-given institutions. It's the music that expresses a society dominated, if you like, by the church, by absolute monarchy, and by feudal relations in society. Every voice has its allotted place each following the other in a kind of strict, what's called counterpoint, note after note. So it's a kind of horizontal musical line, as it's been described. Now, with the beginnings of capitalist economic development in the 17th century, you get a change in music, that expresses and in a sense echoes what is happening in society. So with the decline of feudalism, with the decline of absolute monarchy, and the rise of bourgeois capitalism, mercantile capitalism at the beginning, music is now experiences a significant transformation. You get this growing struggle between musical themes, you get rising tensions, dramatic contrasts and climaxes, and very importantly, the composer's increasing individual expressiveness. And this, I can think, all these things reflect the emergence of competition, capitalist competition. It reflects the emergence of the individual capitalist as the agent of capital accumulation, but an agent who is in competition with other capitalists. And yes, you mentioned tonality, which is of central importance. It's a major 17th century innovation around 1680, associated mainly with the Italian composer Arcangelo Corelli. And the idea is that you get a home key which provides the focus for a piece of music. So the home key is known as the tonic, and other keys, obviously, people who've had a little bit of musical education will understand this perhaps a bit better. Other keys are said to be close or distant. So a piece of music starts off in the kind of tonic, in the main key, say C major or G major or F minor, whatever it is. That's the tonic, the home key. And it wanders through a succession of other keys, a process that's known as modulation. But it returns eventually at the end of the piece of music to the home key. So it needs to return, if you like, to the tonic or the home key. And that is the new system, the new language of music, if you like, that emerges in the late 17th century. At the same time, composers developed the two modes that we know, as I mentioned, major and minor. But one can't overemphasize the central importance of tonality, as I say, with its emphasis on the home key, as these became established towards the end of the 17th century. And I think, arguably, the emergence of tonality as the new language of music, as the new kind of set of rules dominating musical composition, it reflects, I think, the emergence of these strong centers, new centers of economic production, as occurred, with the final elimination of feudal relations on the land and their replacement by capitalist relations, ushered in by the new class of bourgeois owners of capital, both urban and rural. So I think this is all a question of interpretation, but I think this is an argument I think that is valid. The tonality reflects the beginnings of capitalist centers of economic production, the new centers of economic production that are replacing the old, feudal relations on the land. And I start with the late Baroque, whose main protagonists are the two great German composers, Bach and Handel, but also the Italian Vivaldi. Because it's with those three composers that you get the fully established tonal system, which, as I say, regulates chord movements and so on. Okay, I'll leave it at
and you talk about those economic centers. I know you talk at various points about the great centers of music, Vienna and Paris and various cities, but there's also the political developments, which, you've talked about the development of capitalism, but of course that was became a very violent thing that in a whole number of cases the development of capitalism was accompanied by revolution and was accompanied by quite a break with the old society, had to be a break with the old society. So you connect this development with of modern music with the rise of capitalism. Can you briefly explain this process, particularly the challenge to church and state and to absolutism from the Enlightenment, the whole development of those ideas, and also, of course, of the French Revolution, which was perhaps the most important in terms of this break with the old feudal order, and how music kind of fits into that. Because I think for lots of people, when you think about music, of course, if you think about the feudal order, you haven't got a lot of the individuals producing music are doing so for church or aristocracy or monarchy. And how does that all begin to break down?
I mean, this is a very interesting question. I mean, if you look at Bach, for example, Bach wrote church music, and he was the almost like a feudal servant of the church of the Protestant church, the Pietist church in Germany. And he was completely at their service, so to speak. Look at the Austrian composers Haydn and Mozart. They were the servants, if you like, of the nobility, and totally dependent on the nobility. Nevertheless, because of what we said earlier, because great composers, as indeed all great artists, internalize, or perhaps even unconsciously, the most fundamental social political processes taking place around them, they are able to articulate those economic and social and political processes through their art, through their music. As I say, even if this is an unconscious process. I mean, take Mozart, for example. Mozart wrote many letters, many to his father Leopold. And if you look at, and it's according to the year 1789, which is a couple of years before he died, you'd think, well, is there anything about the French Revolution there? And there's not a single word about the French Revolution in any of Mozart's letters. Now, you could say this is possibly, due to the Vienna secret police not wanting to, who were quite active at the time. But probably not. It's probably the fact that despite Mozart's dependence on the Viennese aristocracy, he was able to articulate through his music something much more fundamental. In other words, the emergence of the bourgeois class throughout Europe, that were completing the process of overturning the old feudal order and inaugurating the new bourgeois capitalist system of society. And I think this becomes very clear, for example, in Mozart's orchestral work, is, for example, Symphony Number 40. He wrote 41 symphonies. Symphony Number 40, famous G minor symphony. You get very sharply expressed the tension and conflict of a European society that is undergoing the most profound changes since the collapse of the Roman Empire, if you like. And the rise of medieval feudalism. The most important economic social changes I think are filtered through, expressed in Mozart's orchestral music. But even more clearly, perhaps, are Mozart's operas. So Mozart's operas are permeated with the characters of feudal noblemen whose days are numbered. And numbered as a result of the challenge, the political challenge to those noblemen by their servants, rebellious servants, who challenged their authority. So, for example, in The Marriage of Figaro, Figaro is the servant who defies his master, Count Almaviva's, hitherto undisputed right to the first night of his bride. The old feudal order, if we know, the feudal lord had the right to the servant's bride the first night. And through a lot of the opera, the count, tries to chase Figaro's bride, Susanna, and fails, completely fails. And you look at Mozart's other opera, Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni has a reputation as an all-conquering lover, as a rake. He spends the entire opera chasing a succession of potential female conquests, and he fails in every single case, dismally fails. And he emerges as a singular, unsuccessful rake. And a very interesting aria in Don Giovanni is the aria of the servant, Leporello, who sings in Italian, Voglio fare il gentiluomo. I want to be a master. I don't want to be a servant anymore. Now that would have been unthinkable in any earlier period, of opera. The idea of the servant aspiring to be a master, the idea of social mobility is a late 18th century development, and I think does reflect this notion of, in the French, the career open to the talents, which is a very early but very fundamental bourgeois capitalist principle, aspiration. So, and at the end of, just finally mention here, Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. The Magic Flute, wonderful, wonderful music. You get, at the end of the opera, the sun floods the stage. And I think that flooding of the stage is symbolic of the truth and light of the Enlightenment. The idea that reason must prevail over the authority of the church, over the authority of the absolute monarch. It highlights the values of reason, progress, constitutional government, i.e. values that have to liberate society from the darkness of the old order. And this is what, the early bourgeois ideology was very idealistic, the idea of creating a new society based on freedom, individualism, and so on. Obviously don't mention anything to do with the exploitation of the working class. Indeed, at this stage, there's no real working class. We're still talking about artisans, but nevertheless, you see the aspiration of the bourgeois, new bourgeois, emerging bourgeois capitalist class. Their aim is to liberate society from the old order. And there's, in the French Revolution, as we know, they are able to proclaim on the banner liberty, fraternity, equality, great ideals, which, as we'll see in a moment, greatly influenced Beethoven. Of course, as we see in subsequent decades following the French Revolution of 1789, they didn't mean it. They didn't mean liberty, equality, fraternity. They meant for them liberty for themselves to exploit the majority. But anyway, that's looking ahead.
Yes, and as you say, I suppose the classical musician most identified with support for the French Revolution is Beethoven, who you describe, I think, very, very well. Is kind of, you highlight his musical genius and his very, very radical politics, that he wouldn't bow to the monarch when he met them on a walk, and that he was a great fan of Napoleon, but as soon as he felt Napoleon had betrayed the ideals of the French Revolution, then he became obviously very, very critical. So, what you seem to see Beethoven, and I know this isn't an unusual view, but you see him, I think, as kind of the pinnacle of this phase of the development of music. So, in what way did you think his music reflects those upheavals and the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which were symbolized by the French Revolution?
Yes, as you say, as soon as Beethoven heard that Napoleon had declared himself emperor, having placed great faith in Napoleon as somebody who would continue to fight for the ideals of the French Revolution, having discovered this, Beethoven was totally disillusioned, and he scratched out the dedication, saying to the memory of a great hero or something like that. Beethoven's music represents something of fundamental break. I mean, he's still rooted in the classical musical tradition, but nevertheless, the music is something completely new, and this is visible very early on with his some, for example, piano sonatas, the Pathétique piano sonata, with begins with heavy chords on the piano, and it would have shocked some of his noble patrons. But one important example of the break that Beethoven represents is the Third Symphony, the Eroica, completed in 1802, which does represent a new chapter in music. It begins with two famous chords, two been described as hammer blow chords, and it's a kind of assertion of the will to create a new world, to continue in the tradition of the French Revolution, to continue with the aspirations, I think, of the French Revolution. And in the Fifth Symphony, of course, you know, the famous opening four notes, da 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 dum. The Fifth Symphony has been described as something as Beethoven knocking on the door of history. And there's a strong theme of struggle. Beethoven, of course, Beethoven had to cope with his own personal tragedy, which was his deafness. You know, his deafness is perhaps the greatest tragedy in you know, the history of music. But what Beethoven achieved is also the greatest miracle, you know, despite his deafness. But anyway, in the two opening chords of the Third Eroica Symphony and the four notes of the opening of the Fifth Symphony all express this, seem to express this theme of struggle, confronting a hostile world, a bitter destiny, needing to carry out a fundamental transformation. And then, you know, we read there's Beethoven's opera Fidelio, which is all about, you know, liberating, you know, the attempt to liberate political prisoners who, you know, have been incarcerated. Freedom fighters been incarcerated by this evil jailer, Pissarro. Anyway, so that's also an early indication, you know, of Beethoven setting his face against the existing order, determined to offer his musical expression of resistance, of renewal, of revolutionary transformation, if you like. And then the late period, Beethoven's late period, roughly 1817 to 1827, it contains works of a really unprecedented intellectual innovativeness and emotional depth. And Beethoven, I think, expresses in his late music, the late quartets and the Ninth Symphony in particular, the peak of bourgeois social and ideological creativity, the peak of bourgeois ideological confidence and moral aspiration, if you like. Of course, Beethoven expresses, I think, through those works, his continuing faith in the capacity, the potential of humanity, to future generations of humanity, to reassert the radical spirit that was visible in the French Revolution and indeed in the English Revolution 150 years earlier. So just you get the third movement of the Ninth Symphony, the slow movement. It expresses a kind of tragic lyricism. It's a wonderful lyrical work, the slow movement, the third movement. And I think it feels like a kind of mourning, expression of mourning for the lost ideals of the French Revolution. But the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, known as the choral movement, because there's a chorus at the end of it, the Ode to Joy, which comes from the German poet Schiller. Beethoven had read Schiller's poem as a young man, and he incorporated Schiller's poem in the final movement, which reasserts, I think, Beethoven's belief in humanity's long-term capacity, long-term potential to usher in a world which is based on reason, based on progress, based on human solidarity, and with the elimination of oppression and exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, and that in a way you're talking about as well with Mozart. You had the you know, in the Magic Flute, you get the Enlightenment shining its light, and you've got Beethoven talking about the same kind of thing with the Ode to Joy. I mean, perhaps we move on a little bit to the next phase you talk about, which is the Romantic movement, which I always associate in Britain much more with written, with poetry and written work of various sorts. But you talk about it obviously in terms of the music that, in a way, is a reaction against the development of capitalism, the horrors of industrialization, and you've got a great deal of interest in nature and looking at the natural world. And I was thinking in terms particularly of two of the best known writers of opera at the time, Wagner in Germany and Verdi in Italy, who both not just talked about some of these, or expressed some of these issues, but also talked about national unification, because of course both Germany and Italy were very late in unifying as single capitalist states. They were made up of many smaller principalities and so on and so forth. And obviously, when you look at Wagner and Verdi today, I think people may have very different kind of popular views. That Wagner's often associated with the right and obviously German nationalism, whereas Verdi is much more celebrated, certainly in Italy, as a progressive figure. And I just wonder what you feel about their music, which again, I think you're very, you go into quite a lot of detail about how impressive Wagner's operas are and how important Wagner's operas are. What do you think they can talk to us about today? What can they tell us today?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. I think Wagner in particular has been, and he was a complex character, but I think he's been largely misunderstood or greatly misunderstood. I mean, he did write some anti-Semitic stuff, but the character of Alberich in The Ring is sometimes seen as an anti-Semitic caricature. But nevertheless, in both Verdi and Wagner, you get this, as you say, the aspiration to national unification. But also, there's another side, I think, to both of them. I think in Wagner, on the one hand, in his opera, the late opera, The Master Singers of Nuremberg, the main character, Hans Sachs, does say, the German artists must honor their German masters, and holy German art will live on, even if the Holy Roman Empire vaporizes, he says. So it's an assertion of German nationalism, which Wagner puts into the singing of Hans Sachs, the main character. On the other hand, you see the gods in The Ring. The gods. There's a fight over the gold, the Rhine gold, between the Nibelungen and these mythical characters and the gods who inhabit Valhalla. And at the end, Valhalla is destroyed, is consumed in a fire. The gods are destroyed. And Bernard Shaw wrote an interesting pamphlet in which he puts forward a socialist interpretation of The Ring. In other words, Valhalla, the gods represent the ruling class, a capitalist ruling class, who must be swept aside if a new order is to be created. So I think there is that socialist, if you like, revolutionary element in Wagner, which is often overlooked and which we should remain aware of. And in the case of Verdi, yes, Verdi's early operas, Nabucco in particular, is the famous chorus of the Hebrew slaves, which was at one point was seen as the new prospective Italian national anthem. It's a wonderful tune. Nabucco, seen as the anthem of the Italians struggling to overthrow the Austro-Hungarian yoke of oppression. Also, I Lombardi, another early Verdi opera, contains, I think, a nationalist message. On the other hand, if you look at Verdi's later opera, much later opera, Aida, I think it's 1869, it's a kind of Romeo and Juliet theme. Aida, where Aida and I forget the name of the hero, they're on opposite sides of the battle, but between the two competing forces, and yet they are lovers. They are secret lovers. So, in other words, there is something that can rise above and beyond national competitive national rivalry, and that that is the love of that can unite opposite potential existing opposite forces in a higher unity, if you like. So I think Verdi does express a kind of internationalist, does convey an internationalist message, in Aida, which is very interesting. Again, it's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to talking a little bit about Marxism and art, because you mentioned Leon Trotsky, and I think his writing on art is incredibly valuable.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have just said, because I think what's important also in looking at so-called nationalist operas composed by Verdi and Wagner, to the extent that there is that nationalist message, whether that's relevant to today, to national struggles. And I think we have to say that it is still relevant, for most obviously in the case of Palestine, but also some would say maybe, Irish Republicans, nationalists, still struggling for Irish unification, possibly the Muslim Uyghurs of China, oppressed, arguably some would say an oppressed nation. So certainly the idea of nationalist struggle, against the struggle against nationalism, the oppression of nationalism, remains relevant in the world today.
Absolutely, I think that's it's a very important point. And when you think about the slave chorus that you mentioned in Nabucco, is an incredibly inspiring piece of music, actually. And I think anybody who cares about any sort of liberty, but particularly people who are looking to national liberation, would look to that as a potential anthem, as something that they could potentially look to. So yeah, I think that's the whole national question. And of course, if you look at Palestine, if you look at Ireland, if you look at a whole number of other nationalisms, you've also seen the development of art in quite specific and very, very impressive ways through music and poetry and all sorts of other things. So yeah, I think that's right. I was just going to talk a little bit about Trotsky, because as you mentioned earlier, he writes some fantastically important stuff about music, not mainly about music, about literature. I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, because again, I think people get the idea that socialists, when you look at art, why would you like dead white men, dead white Europeans? What have they got to tell us about the present day? And I think you've explained in a number of ways very, very well what they do have to say to us. And Trotsky was dealing with, at the time, obviously a revolutionary situation and a post-revolutionary situation in Russia, where lots of people wanted art to be directly connected to socialist ideals. And he was very critical of this. And he was very critical of the idea that all art had to have a sort of socialist message. And he talks about classical art, and he talks about all sorts of different ways of looking at it, as he sees art as the way that the individual inside capitalist society tries to make sense of the world and tries to make sense of a class society which has deprived us of our full feelings and understanding and has alienated us from the product of our labor and all that kind of thing. So I think it's an interesting question. You do address it in your book. How much do you think the works that you've described, and how much do they say something to us today? Because they are obviously, when people, do you need, for example, if you're listening to Beethoven, do you need to know about the French Revolution? Or if you're listening to Wagner, do you need to know about these things? Or is there a means by which they say something to us which would apply in very, very different circumstances that we live in today?
Yes, definitely. I think your reference to Trotsky again is very, very important. the period you refer to, the early 20s after the Russian Revolution, is fantastically important. I think the way in which the Bolsheviks, Trotsky in particular, tried to convey the great treasures of bourgeois art to the working class and the peasants, to a semi-literate peasantry. It's extraordinary, really, that you think of, the period of, just after the Civil War, with the huge destructiveness that created, that wrought on the Russian Revolution and the Soviets and so on. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks found, Trotsky in particular, found time to highlight the importance of art and culture for the new working class and for a future socialist society. And I think what Trotsky understood very well is that, as you said, as we've discussed, is that artists internalize the social world that they inhabit, albeit unconsciously, as we mentioned earlier. So through art is not a realm that exists above our social and political world. Art is very much part of our world and reflects and expresses what is going on in society, and we can use art and music in particular. Although Trotsky, as you say, didn't talk about music. Interestingly, Trotsky had some fascinating insights into European literature. Again, following on what Marx and Engels, for example, what Marx and Engels, when they talk about Balzac, how Balzac hated the French Revolution, but he saw more clearly than anybody what the new capitalist relations were doing to society. So even as a consciously right-wing author, he nevertheless illuminated through his writing, through his literary work, the inner workings of the new capitalist order. And I think it's similar with Dostoevsky in Russia. He does the same thing. Was a right-winger, Russian patriot, or believer in the Orthodox Church, and so nevertheless, his writings illuminate in a way that is in the highest possible way, in the most sensitive, sophisticated way, highlights the inner workings of the new order, the new capitalist order. And I think music provides the same opportunity. And I think Trotsky understood this, the way in which artists internalize the social world. They are part of the social world, even if it's an unconscious way. And this, again, and this is what I try to highlight in the book, particularly in the early section, where talk about Trotsky's attempt to make sense, of an alienated world through art, in this case through classical music.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you refer to Balzac in particular, I think many people would see him as a kind of expression of some of the best of the bourgeois literature of the 19th century, which, as you say, expresses their worldview. Now, we know that as capitalism develops, not just do you get this kind of looking back to a pre-capitalist age with the Romantics, but you also get in what's called the modern period, modernism, if you like, in the 20th century. You get a kind of fragmentation that the bourgeoisie starts off as a revolutionary class, but then, of course, becomes the opposite. It doesn't want revolution because it knows its own power will be overthrown. And therefore, the artists who develop as part of that capitalist society, where you've no longer got this confident revolutionary bourgeoisie, you've got a bourgeoisie which is trying to keep the lid on future revolutions, and there's a much more fragmented approach to it that and I think you reflect that in the book. I mean, you cover, I think I'm right in saying, quite a wide number of 20th century musicians and composers with very different approaches, some of the Americans, Stravinsky, all sorts of different ones. How do you think, do you think you can talk in a straightforward way about 20th century music, or do you think it fragments so much that you can only talk about individuals and how much does it express the alienation and fragmentation of people's lives in modern capitalism?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. As you say, the latter part of the 19th century sees the beginnings of, what we describe as capitalist decline. The bourgeoisie, having proclaimed this new social order, having totally transformed the world, the advanced world, I mean, Europe and North America, through the Industrial Revolution, that transformation of society begins to be undermined. The beginnings of for example, the Great Depression of the 1870s. It begins to ask questions of the new social and economic order. Is it, quite apart from the horrific exploitation of the new working class, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois order clearly begins to fail in terms of its own conscious objectives, and towards the end of the 19th century. And you get, then you get the export of capital, you get the colonialism, imperialism, rival imperialisms pitted against each other, a rivalry that culminates in the First World War and then in the Second World War. The Russian Revolution is a beacon of hope, but that sadly it fails to spread, and you get the emergence of Stalinism in Russia and the imposition of a new, what we might call a new state capitalist order. So all these developments represent the failure of the bourgeois class to create a world society, based on all the aspirations that they expressed, the late 18th century, early 19th century, of equality, liberty, and so on. We get the opposite. We get the horrific exploitation of the majority of society, the horrific oppression of colonial peoples in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. And I think this failure to transform the world along positive, creative lines finds expression in music. It finds expression in modernism, and I think it does. Modernism expresses the new alienation of the working class, of the majority of society, the alienation of the working class, the producers of wealth, from the wealth that they create, and it expresses the increasing separation of the majority of society, the oppressed, from those who control the world we live in today. And I think you get this through the work of three main composers. In France, Claude Debussy, in Russia, Igor Stravinsky, and Arnold Schoenberg in Vienna, who is the main protagonist of what's known as the New Viennese School. And Debussy transforms the kind of forms of society. He writes suites. He does write operas as well, but he writes suites. And I think the first the suite that indicates is the kind of harbinger of modernist music is his La Comédie d'un Faune, which is based on a Greek classical story. Then you get Schoenberg. Schoenberg carries out the atonal revolution around 1908, 1909. In other words, music is kind of freed from its, in a sense, from its dependence on the tonal language, on the set of tonal rules. So you no longer have a home key, and music no longer has to, go through a series of different keys and return to the home key. The home key is no longer the focus of a piece of music. Music just wanders, across different, atonal pastures, if you like. And then Stravinsky revolutionizes. Music through rhythmic transformation. And you get this in, for example, a very good example in his great opera, his great ballet, the Rite of Spring, which was performed in Paris in 1913, I think, the first performance, and there is the rhythmic the rhythmic the rhythm there created an absolute rebellion in the audience. If you listen to the Rite of Spring, it created the audience exploded in anger at the what was a completely innovative, something they'd never heard before, this pounding rhythm of the ballet. Anyway, and I think if they take those three, Debussy, Schoenberg, Debussy's, as you say, the suite, the faun, Schoenberg's atonal music, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. These composers, they express a world dominated by 2 world wars, colonial oppression, the threat of nuclear extinction of humanity. Today, the climate emergency, the continuing economic crisis. These are the composers that express the new world we live in the 20th century. And I think they completely vindicate this whole notion on which I tried to base my book, that music does express the society we live in. It expresses, both its values, its ideals, its hopes and aspirations, and the failure and the alienation that results from that failure, and perhaps can help to invigorate us in our quest. Those of us who are socialists, who want to overturn the existing neoliberal capitalist order that has failed humanity and create a new world based on socialism, based on the values of human love and human solidarity. And I think, and that's where I end my book.
Yes, and I think as people who've watched and listened to this will know, this gives you only a small glimpse of the very, very detailed and very informative analysis that's in this book. So thanks very much, Sabby. There's just one final question I'd like to ask you, which is, if you could choose your ideal musical experience, what would it be? What would you do? Would you
a desert island choice?
A desert island choice. It can be of anybody in history, or it can be something that you're going to tomorrow night, or whatever. What would it be?
Can I have 2?
You can, yes.
Well, I think Mozart's Magic Flute would be one, and possibly Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, because these express the great hopes. And I think if I would also, if I had instead of the works of Shakespeare, I think Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So that I've cheated a bit.
Okay, well, that's fine. No, those are the ones that you would choose above the others. Great. Well, thank you very, very much for doing the interview. I would really recommend people to get this book. Here it is again. It's Music and Capitalism. There is a special offer on it, at least till the end of September, where you can buy it relatively cheaply. I think it's about £25 from Bookmarks Bookshop. You can get it online. So we'll put details of that with this interview. But thanks very, very much again for doing it, Sabby. And I really recommend people to read this book to find out more about what is an absolutely fascinating subject.
So thank you very much, Lindsay. Thanks for inviting me to do this interview. It's been really great. So really
Great.
Appreciate your kind words.